Good morning. It's Charmaine Hammond. We're here today for our monthly membership call. The folks that have wanted to join our newsletter list, I've met you at workshops, conferences, or perhaps I've done some training for you in your workplace. Welcome. We're at our May call, and we've got a couple of things we're going to talk about today. One of those is improving morale in uncertain times. Many of you are in uncertain times right now, so we're going to talk about how to improve morale and how to also improve resilience. The more resilient that people are in an organization, typically the better their morale, the better their ability to work together. We're also going to talk about a team charter. Many of you were asking questions about team charters and how did we build a team charter, so that's the other part that we're going to talk about today. Now, in terms of who I am and what I do, you've all met me at a workshop, conference, or training in your organization, but as you know, my first career was in corrections. I was a correctional officer in Ontario. And then I went back to school, got a master's degree in conflict analysis and management. And that was a fantastic program in terms of what it taught me about team dynamics, the workplace, and resolving some of the challenges that happen all the time, regardless of the industry that you work in. And then I opened up my dispute resolution practice almost 20 years ago. I no longer do that. We've since rebranded and changed our company around quite a bit. But I opened my business in 1997, initially as a dispute resolution company in Fort McMurray, Alberta. And I was resolving some of the toughest conflicts that happen in the workplace. I also was facilitating family conflicts, and boy, oh boy, the workplace conflicts were much easier to deal with in one sense than family. And then I decided about 15 years ago that my passion was really speaking and training, and I was getting called on more and more in organizations to teach the skills of conflict resolution, effective communication, stress management, dealing with change. And then I decided that I really wanted to move away from the whole world of being in the throes of the conflict, facilitating conflict for people. And instead, I would look at helping people learn the skills that they needed for conflict resolution and communication. So that's a little bit about me. I've traveled around the world, spoke to thousands and thousands of people, more than 250,000 people, and I love what I do. So let's rock and roll here. The first item we wanted to talk about was morale. Now you'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen you have a chat box. You're welcome to ask questions, make comments. If you've got ideas or resources or things you're doing in your workplace that you'd like to share, please share them there. I know that one of the best parts of doing webinars is that we can learn from one another, not just from the information that I'm sharing. So feel free to chat away, and I will be looking at the questions as we go through. Now, many of you are facing workplaces with uncertain times. I just want to stop and give a shout out to friends and colleagues and clients in Fort McMurray. Many of you know, if you're listening from Canada specifically, you've heard that they've had to evacuate their community as a result of some horrific, horrible forest fires. And it's been a terrifying experience. And people are still they're still displaced out of the community. And I just want to give a shout out to all of the people in government, in social profit, nonprofit organizations, the emergency responders, the people that are keeping the community and everyone safe and helping out around the world. I just want to appreciate you all. That was my home for 16 years before we moved to Edmonton area. And it has a really big place in my heart. So thank you for everything you've been doing to help that community and the people that call it home. Now, when we think about uncertain times, I don't think it can get any more uncertain than what's going on right now in Fort McMurray. And, you know, when people return to the community, the workplace is going to be very, very uncertain. People aren't, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty around job stability. Will people be returning to the community? What will their job look like? You know, so it's really hard to say. Now, that ripples out, though, in other ways in workplaces, uncertainty. Let me give you an example. One of the organizations that I work with, they're a nonprofit organization. They've been around a long time, 40 years, I think, so they've got longevity. And they've gone through a number of program changes. So what I mean by that is their funding model has changed and their funders have changed. And in the nonprofit organizations, often your dollars to operate certain services come on a year-to-year basis because it's funded by companies or government, and those cycles go year to year. So there's a lot of uncertainty in many nonprofit organizations simply because they don't know if their funding is going to come in. Can any of you on the webinar today relate to that? Often nonprofits get what would you call it, project funding. So they have funding to hire someone to do a specific project, and then when the project is done and the money's gone, that person probably isn't with the team anymore. So there's often a lot of uncertainty. So this organization, 40 years they've been around, lots of project funding, lots of year-by-year funding. They finished a 3-year program. They were really lucky to get 3 years of consecutive dollars for this particular program. But as it was coming to an end, the stress level in that organization increased 100%. This was a group who really worked well together. A lot of them were longtime employees. They really had systems and processes to support them. But the closer that 3-year date was coming, the higher the stress level got. People were anticipating, that the person who had the position was going to be leaving. It would throw everything sort of upside down. Rumors started to happen. We see that all the time in the workplace when people don't know answers. They make them up. You've all experienced that, right? And then you spend a lot of time putting out the rumor mill. Now, in this case, what the executive director and the board did, I thought was stellar, and we can all learn from it. They created, actually, first of all, they had a meeting. Not a staff meeting, more of a communication meeting to just simply share knowledge and see where people were at. So there wasn't any other agenda items on the table, and people were able to ask questions. Boy, what were the questions? Will she have a job at the end of 3 years? What will happen to all the clients that we served in this program over the last 3 years? Are we going to lose all that money? How will that affect the organization? And the board and the executive director did something exceptional in the moments that they didn't have answers, because they simply didn't know some of the answers. And they were honest and integral and said, these are questions that we don't yet have the answer for, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that when we can find the answers, we will communicate the facts back to you. We will stay in touch. And they continued to actually ramp up their staff meetings. They originally met once a month, and they ramped that up to 2 or 3 times a month to keep the communication going. So what they saw is the stress level that was up here started to decline because people were feeling cared for, people were feeling listened to. And that's really what we want to do, is provide answers and make people feel safe. That's so, so critical. Now, what do we do around improving morale in uncertain times? One of the pieces is just what I talked about, providing information. When people have information, even if it's not good information, they can at least deal with it. They can start to cope with it. They can ask questions. They can figure it out in their own minds. They can look at what other options they might want to be exploring. When people don't have information, even if the answer is, we don't know yet, but we promise we will tell you, and here's what we're going to do in the meantime, even if that's the answer, people can get their head around it. What happens is when nothing's being said, and this is often the case in workplaces, I see it all the time. When nothing's being said, people pick up on innuendos. They overhear a part of a conversation. They make up the bigger answer. They make a lot of assumptions. And people, when we make assumptions, 90% of them are wrong. They're not even accurate. And then we go away and act on them. So we want to make sure that in times of uncertainty, we communicate often, we communicate in different ways. So we have staff meetings, that's one form of communication. We follow up with the meeting minutes, that's a second touch, a second form of communication. Then maybe we talk to people one-on-one in a supervision type meeting. That's a third piece of information. Maybe we then have a Q&A session Or maybe we write a Q&A document. I've seen that happen before in organizations where they write out a Q&A document about what's going on in the workplace, and it's a private document for the staff only, but it's maintained in the organization. Because the other part of the challenge is, as you're out there communicating messages, we have people who are absent because they're sick, they're away on holidays, so they miss the memo. Literally, they miss the memo. And they come back and they're here at their information understanding, and then the rest of the team is here. And then what happens often is the person who missed the memo feels that they were left out, that there was some kind of malicious action. People make all kinds of assumptions. So the more we can do to manage the rumor mill, communicate frequently and in many forms, that's called cascading messages, and the more that we can actually answer questions, the better we will be improving morale. It's often the simple things that we do, and often the most obvious things that we think we need to do that never happen. And when you take those steps, you can create dramatic increase in morale, cohesiveness, synergy, and ultimately the way in which the people work together and get through tough times. Now, here's one of the things that happens in a tough time in a workplace. So change, downsizing, lack of dollars, downsizing can actually have another effect, though, not just losing employees and money. It takes out a whole bunch of corporate information when someone leaves. So someone who's been in an organization for a long time has this file cabinet in their brain. They have the history of the organization. They've been through it all, and when they leave, they take that corporate knowledge with them. Now, there's another side to uncertain times and tough times. It might not be downsizing at all. We've all been through those times of extreme craziness. The pace is high, the work demands are off the charts, we can barely keep up. That's a time where morale often goes down. So making sure that people are resilient is critical in morale, because when people get tired, they get frustrated. When people get frustrated, old issues come out. You've all seen it, haven't you? Old issues you thought you resolved years ago, they're right there again. So we want to make sure that we resolve old issues, that we give people the opportunity to take breaks. There's something interesting that happens in a pace that's really busy and demanding. What if you're a leader? Please know that how you show up every day actually sets the pace and the tone for your team. So if I'm a leader that comes in at 5 o'clock to get started, and I have that 3 hours of quiet before everybody gets in, one of the challenges that happens is I have 3 hours to write emails to people. I'm sharing a personal story. So when I had my company up in Fort McMurray, the demands were really, I had 2 businesses, and I had about 12 staff at one point between 2 businesses, and I was busy. And I would come in at about 6 o'clock in the morning. Staff didn't start till 8:30, and I get a jump start on the day. Well, one of the staff had the courage to come up to me and she said, "Charmaine, I know that you need that time to work, but when I come in on especially a Monday morning, and you've been here all weekend, I come in to 20 emails from you. I come in and the first thing I see is all these emails, and because you're my supervisor, you own the company, I feel compelled that nothing else is more important in that moment than answering your emails." And I thought, wow, I so appreciated her courage to share that feedback with me. And they were all feeling overwhelmed. And here I thought I was getting a jump start on the day and being proactive and getting things off my plate. But what I was doing was then putting things on their plate. And 90% of what I was emailing about was a 2-minute conversation that I could have stopped in their office when they showed up for work and had a quick conversation. So I actually contributed to the feeling of morale and stress in the workplace. We quickly changed that. And I used that time. I still came in early, but I used that time to work on the business. That's when I did other tasks, projects, writing books, to actually work on other parts of the business. Now, in terms of also if you're a leader and you're listening, the other thing that happens is if your team sees you rushing about, you're sort of fast on the go, that you're not taking breaks, that you're not eating lunch, you're sort of eating at the computer, you're not taking coffee breaks, you're not really accessible, what that does is it sets that tone in the workplace. So you'll start to see people not taking breaks, rushing about, really working quickly through projects. And what happens for us in the workplace is we can actually increase potential safety risks because people are distracted, they're not focused on their work, they're not focused on safety. We actually create an office or an organization where people start to work in silos, where they're not well connected. Everybody's off on their own doing their work, but the team energy is starting to decline. And the other result of if we show up that way all the time is people actually get worried. Um, I've heard things like, well, I want to be able to contribute. I see my supervisor running around with, crazy, crazy, crazy busy. And I feel like I'm not doing enough, or I feel like I'm not helping enough. So be really careful. And this applies for all of us, not just leaders. Be careful about how you show up. How you show up in the workplace shapes how people treat you, how people communicate with you, your stress level. It shapes everything. So spend time on thinking about how you're going to show up in the workplace. Now, the last part about ways to improve morale, ask people. I always believe in authenticity and integrity. So if you're feeling that morale is low, talk to people one-on-one. What do you, and don't get bogged into the problems. Don't get pulled down by the conversation of the problems. Look at what could be better, what could improve. Bring it up at a staff meeting. Guys, I'm noticing, boy, we just seem to be in a slump right now. Our energy's lower, or we feel a bit disjointed. Is anyone else feeling this? Can we spend some time figuring out how we're going to get through this together? So find ways to keep the lines of communication open and bring people in to solving the problem with you. These are all ways to improve morale. A couple of other ways. If you have rumors or gossip, so if you are hearing scuttlebutt, that's not accurate, correct information immediately. Really important. The longer rumors go on, the tougher they are to clarify and resolve, and people get attached to what they think the answer is. So even if you're clarifying what the information is, people get attached to what they've heard, and they still think it's the right answer. So spend time working through some of those myths and assumptions and rumors that are going on. The other thing is asking people what would help them feel better about being at work. So what I mean by that is asking them, what would help reduce the stress? I have found my best answers have come from the frontline staff. They just seem to know what will fix the situation. And getting staff involved allows them to be part of the solution. I think that's really empowering, and it builds a culture of togetherness and that we're in this together. Now let's move on to team charters. And please, if you've got any questions, you can pop those in the chat box. I will answer your questions. Love to hear your comments. I'd actually love to hear what you're doing to improve morale, because all of you have been through busy times, slow times, changing times, stressful times. What have you found has made an impact on improving morale? Tell us in the chat box, and I'll keep going here with team charters, but I'd love to hear what you're doing to improve morale. Now, team charters. Team charters are an agreement that teams make together around how they're going to work together. Now, many of you have heard me talk about team charters before because I weave this into a lot of different workshops. It's such an important tool. Now, a team charter and the process to create a team charter is typically best facilitated by an external consultant. I love it when I get the opportunity to go into workplaces and help facilitate a team charter process with them, because it allows the leader, it allows everyone on the team to participate fully and equally. And that's where you're going to get the best results. If a team charter is led by a leader, it starts to feel like a leadership down agreement. And then people aren't as invested in the solution. So if you really want to have people invested, make sure that you work with someone externally to help facilitate the process so that everyone can be a part of it. And basically what a team charter does is it allows the team to come together and put some structure around the policies and procedures that guide us at work. Now, we all have policies and procedure manuals, and they explain things like how decisions get made, how conflicts get resolved, how complaints get addressed. But the challenge is that our policies and procedures don't always give people the tools. It says, here's step 1, step 2, step 3. But if I am really nervous in those kind of conversations, if I had a bad experience, I concern up and I was reprimanded for it, it means that people often will not follow the policy and the procedure. One of the areas I see this a lot is in gossip. Now, most policy manuals that I've seen actually don't have a policy around gossip. They address it in other ways, through things like a respectful, accepting workplace where we're appreciating diversity. So gossip always gets addressed in other ways. But when I get together with teams, they talk about gossip and they talk about it a lot, because the negative form of gossip, so remember there's good gossip, which we want. That's the gossip where people are cheering each other on, when they're being supportive, when they're sharing each other's good news stories. But there's negative gossip that is often not intended to be malicious. It's often people speaking without thinking of the impact that what they've said on somebody else. Gossip also happens when people don't have answers. So back to the earlier conversation. And sometimes you will have people that like to stir the pot, where their comfort is being in the drama rather than in the solution. We need to deal with that right away. We need to provide feedback and sometimes a much deeper conversation around that specific behavior. When a team comes together for a team charter process, they talk about gossip. And we talk about in the process what the team can expect from each other if gossip happens. So let me give you an example. Let's say that one of the staff just overheard part of a conversation as they were walking by the door, and it was a management meeting, and they heard 2 or 3 sentences. Now, on the way walking towards their office, they make up a couple of answers in their head about what that could have meant. We see it all the time, don't we? And then they go to one of their colleagues and they say, "Oh, you'll never guess what I just heard." Now, they say what they just heard, but they say it with some nonverbals and some tones of voice that really beef up the storyline. They might add information in, and they might not have any intention about being harmful or malicious. But that person that they've just spoken to might go into an extreme sense of fear. They're starting to worry about their job security. They go and tell somebody else, and before you know it, everybody in the team has different information, and people are responding to the information that they think is accurate, and it's not, but they think it's accurate, and that leads to a whole other problem. So in a team charter process, we talk about how gossip will be handled. For example, let's go back to that situation. If the person who overheard something came to their colleague, they could actually choose to say nothing. That would be a great, great start. That person that they're going to go and tell it to can't solve it, can't fix it, can't speak to it. Who could speak to it was the supervisor that was in the room where the conversation was overheard. So teaching people to be able to go back to the source is really important. So in a team charter, we actually practice what that would look like, what words would have that conversation. And it might be simply one of the staff going over to the supervisor later privately saying, when I walked by the office, I heard something. I've not shared this with anyone. I want you to know that, but I heard something that just alarmed me. And I just wanted to be able to bring that back to you. Before I start making up answers in my head, and I know it might be something that you can't even talk about with me, I want to reassure you that I've not said anything, nor do I plan to. And the supervisor might say, "Oh, Charmaine, you heard about 3 seconds in the context of a much bigger conversation. This is what the conversation was actually about. There's nothing to worry about." Or the supervisor might say, "Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate you keeping that confidential. And there's absolutely nothing to be worried about here, but it was a private management meeting and I can't share anything more than that, but I want you to be reassured that there's absolutely nothing to be concerned about." And see, then it stops, instead of a supervisor later having to go and fix a whole bunch of other misperceptions and miscommunication. In team charters, we also talk about if a colleague came to gossip about somebody, what they could say on the receiving end to get out of the conversation. This is a tough part for people. A lot of times gossip happens in the workplace simply because people don't have the skills to remove themselves from the dialogue. So they listen, they don't nod their head, they just sort of listen. And What happens though is by the nature of being in the conversation and simply listening, even if you're not participating, when you're listening, you're still participating. So we need to teach people the skills to get out of that dialogue. And that's one of the things that team charters can really help with. Now, team charters also talk about how the team is going to address and resolve disagreements and conflict together. This is a great, great part of a team charter, probably my favorite part to facilitate. In the workplace, people are really afraid of hurting each other's feelings. You've seen it, right? In the workplace, people are concerned about um, making things worse. That's one of the reasons they don't address an issue. They don't want to make it worse. Maybe they had a bad experience. They brought something up before and it just went off the tracks. Maybe they're fearful of conflict. Maybe they lack confidence to bring issues up. Maybe they simply just don't know what to say to get the conversation started. A team charter can actually provide a sense of confidence and safety for people around conflict. And one of the things I did with one team charter, it was a small business about, I think about 50 employees, and we had about 40 of them at the team charter process. And this was an area for them. They were a small enough group, they worked very closely together, and they were long-term employees. They'd all worked together for years. In fact, there was a lot of blurred lines between friendship and coworkers, which was part of what they also had to figure out in their team charter, because when new people got hired, they felt like they were excluded and like they didn't fit in. And that came out in the team charter process, so they could deal with it immediately. But what they needed to do was to look at what's preventing them from bringing feedback up to each other. You know, somebody made a mistake and nobody will go and tell the person, you made a mistake. It's no big deal. Here's how we need to do it instead. So they let things linger, gossip would happen. People wouldn't give that task to the person again. They'd take it on to save them from another mistake. Meanwhile, the person who made the mistake is wondering, what the heck is going on? What did I do? So they start getting nervous and fearful. It creates a whole challenge, doesn't it, in the workplace? When the team talked about it, they came up with actually some one-liners, is what they called them, about what they could say to each other if someone came into the room to gossip about them or if they felt uncomfortable. And it simply sounded something like this. You know what? It feels weird to me to be having a conversation about Sue without Sue being here. I'm just going to check out of it. And they use that term, I'm just going to check out of the conversation. And it was used with a tone of voice, something like mine. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it wasn't accusatory. It was simply, I'm going to pass on this conversation. And it gave them the permission to check out of the dialogue. And they practiced that. And then I heard about a month later, they had numerous opportunities, because people do interesting things. When we have a new rule, we test it, right? We test the boundaries. And we also sometimes don't make that adjustment between the old way and the new way. So it's not anything about testing. It's simply that we're getting used to something new. And there were some moments of boundaries being tested, and people would say, you know, I'm feeling weird about this. I'm going to do what we decided in our team charter with Charmaine, and I'm going to check out of the conversation. And it just became acceptable for them to do that. And they practiced similar skills on other areas of challenge for them in the team charter. Now, the other cool part about a team charter is that it's written down, and different teams will decide to write a team charter down in different ways. I've had them sort of type it up almost like meeting minutes. I've had people type it up like an agreement where people sign it. I've had people type it up like an agreement where people sign it and they actually add what their commitment to the team charter is. Isn't that a neat one? I really liked that when that team did that. We actually had one team that I facilitated. It was a government organization, and they had 2 artists on staff, incredible artists. And so one of the artists on staff actually over the weekend took the team charter and laid it out over this beautiful artwork that he had created and brought it into the team. And that hangs in their office years later. They look at it, they're reminded of it. And see, that's what's important about a team charter, because when life gets tough and busy and confusing, when workplace messes happen, we don't usually run over to the binder and find the policy and the procedure that relates to it. Whereas a team charter that's maybe hanging on people's wall, or another thing I've seen people do is with the security cards that people wear around their neck with the lanyards. One of the teams that I had condensed their 4-page team charter into 10 ways that we work together to support our team. And they actually printed that double-sided on a sort of like a credit card size that hung behind their security badge on their lanyard. They wore it every day. In fact, that particular company that I facilitated that for, there was so much good gossip in the organization because people were showing them their team charter at lunch breaks and, out on the job site. And people were going to their supervisor saying, hey, we want one of those cards. We want that. And of course, because each charter is specific to, actually started looking at rolling team charter processes out throughout the organization. Now think about the culture shift when that happens. You have one team in a department of other teams in a company of even more teams. And so that particular team that has the team charter has pretty minimal ability to affect the culture. However, they still have ability to affect the bigger culture. But imagine when you have 2 or 4 or 5 teams in one department with a team charter. That all ultimately come down to working and creating a respectful workplace. And imagine the impact now of 3 or 4 or 5 teams have on a much bigger organization. So that's the other thing that's interesting about team charters. If you work in an organization that has more than one team, you have the ability to shift the environment to create a culture of respect and acceptance and diversity. So I'd be interested, if you've ever gone through a team charter process, feel free to put your comments up on the chat box. And also, if you've got questions about team charters or building a respectful workplace or improving morale in the workplace, please type them in the chat box. I did have a couple of questions that came on from people who can't come on live today, but they're going to be listening to the video replay because we are recording this to be able to send out to people. The question was, what about if you have people who are part of building a team charter and they don't want to play fair? And so what the person meant by that is they've been part of the team charter and they're saying at the meeting, I agree, I'm behind this, I'm going to live this, breathe this. And then they get back to the workplace and they sort of, I'm not doing that. That was just ridiculous. They've not committed. They've bought in and checked out. This happens a lot in staff meetings. Let's just take this to what we can all relate to, because not all of you have team charters. In staff meetings, in board meetings, if you volunteer on a board, you've seen it. At the staff meeting, everyone's in agreement to something. Okay, we're going to agree to that. Yep, we're good. Here's how we're going to handle that situation. So everybody agrees in the staff meeting, and then they leave the staff meeting, and you have what's called the meeting outside the meeting, or the meeting after the meeting. You get what I'm talking about, right? You've probably seen it. It's where people agree in a meeting, and then when the meeting's over, they go back to their offices or to their areas, and they start to talk about how crazy that was, or why they're not going to do that, or I'm not going to follow that. And so they've had the meeting and they've agreed, and now they've had another meeting and agreed why they're not going to follow what was agreed to. It happens all the time. I was doing a team building process with a group. It was one of the first team building processes I ever did. It was about 15, 17 years ago now, I guess. And it was with a nonprofit organization that I've been involved with a lot over the years as a volunteer. It was one of my first jobs, actually. So fast forward many years after I was an employee, and I was coming in to facilitate a team process. Nobody that I worked with was there. They were all long gone. And I can't even remember what the decision was that we were talking about, but they all agreed and they were excited. And I know about this stuff. So I have a process where when we have an agreement, I actually go around the room. I don't just say, does everyone agree? And some people stare at you like this, and some people nod, and some people look over to their neighbor, because what does that mean? Does that mean you're agreeing, or you've just heard me? So I actually get agreement. So around this group, I had everybody said, yes, I agree. I even had them say, and here's what I will do to support the agreement. So we're going around the room, and each person says their commitment, and yes, they agree. And then I double checked. I said, so nobody is in disagreement. Is that what I hear? That's right, Charmaine. So, so the next day I get a call from the executive director, the board president, saying, you need to come back. We need to bump our meeting up. And I said, why? And they said, because now there's all these staff that are not agreeing to what we all agreed to and voiced our concerns. So I coached her through how to have a conversation. She actually pulled an emergency staff meeting. I loved how she handled this. She could have let this go for 2 weeks until our next meeting. That would have been catastrophic for the team. It would have wrecked everything that we'd worked on. Instead, she actually used the team charter. She called the emergency staff meeting, even had 2 people rebook meetings to be there. That's how important she made this, because she had invested a lot of time and money into this process. That meant that all the staff were not out doing their jobs. They were in that room that day. So there was a financial impact, a time impact, and she was very committed to this process. So the team comes in and she just very clearly, very professionally, no blame, no anger, says, it has come to my attention that after yesterday's meeting where everyone agreed to this, this, and this, and each of you went around and explained your commitments, and she actually read it right off the meeting minutes that I had sent her after the meeting, and she said, I know that some of you have checked out of this agreement. I have heard a conversation, I've had people come to me, and we need to talk about this right now. And let's have a conversation. And she created a safe space for people to do that. Now, initially, everybody just looked at each other and waited for someone to speak, she said. And then people sort of didn't want to finger point. And so they would talk in these generalizations like everybody or nobody. She did a great job of saying, who do you mean by everybody? Who's nobody? And really trying to pin down what the problem was and to find out why they agreed and why they didn't agree the next day. What was going on? Did we miss something? What she came up with is everyone still agreed. Some people were just having a hard time with the transition. And there was a couple staff on there that historically would sideline new initiatives. And so she actually had one-to-one meetings with those 2 people and said that can't happen anymore. That's no longer okay. That kind of behavior doesn't support our culture that we're creating, which is one of cohesiveness and upfront open communication and supporting one another and respect. And those 2 staff that she had to give critical feedback to, and it was very uncomfortable for her, really uncomfortable, those 2 staff became the champions of the charter. These 2 staff were the ones that actually flew with it and became the biggest advocates in that organization for their team charter. So when we deal with things immediately, respectfully, and successfully, we can turn things around. Now let's look at what would have happened if she let it go for 2 weeks and I didn't even hear about it. So let's take that scenario. So I show up 2 weeks later. I'm coming with the expectation that everyone agreed 2 weeks ago. And everything is fine. Now, we always do a recap, right, for the second meeting or the follow-up meeting. So I would obviously ask, how are things going since we last got together? And I probably would have got silence or people looking down because people know what's going on, but they don't necessarily want to point each other out. And so this is a great opportunity then to fix it. That's all it is. It's an opportunity to fix it and get it right and to have people be accountable. So if that happened, if I had people looking down or people being silent, probably what I would have said is something like, wow, I'm really curious as to what happened between real big excitement and each of you expressing how you're going to support the team charter and commit to it, to asking for feedback on how it went, and there's silence. Help me understand the disconnect. And I might get silence again. Nobody wants to say anything. So that what I might do is go around and say, you know, I'm going to have you all go around and check back on your commitments. So Sally, you said you were going to do this, this, and this. How did you do with that over the last couple weeks? How did you do? And I would go around and ask everyone. And the intent is to build that honest, open, integral communication where it's okay for people to say, you know what? I didn't do a good job, Charmaine. I fell into my old patterns. I was really committed, but then I walked away and I don't know, I was complaining about it and I'm feeling awful. And then we can deal with that. We can fix it. We can say, so what would need to happen so you don't feel awful? What needs to happen so you can stick with it longer than a day? because think about what William Bridges says. I love this guy's writing. William Bridges writes about change and transition, and he is a fantastic perspective that when I heard it, it changed everything about how I understand workplace change. And workplace change is going to happen for all of us tomorrow, next week, next year. It's going to happen because it's part of any time you bring in a new policy, that's change. Anytime you create a new form or a process or a system, that's change. You have a staff go on maternity leave, that's change. You have a new program starting, that's change. It happens all the time. Some people cope great, some people struggle with it. So William Bridges says that change actually starts with an ending. So isn't that interesting? Because we think about change as a beginning, a new policy, a new staff, a new board, a new financial year, a new budget. We think of that as a beginning. And William Bridges says that change begins with an ending. This is really important to understand how it affects how people cope. So if change begins with an ending, that means people have to say goodbye to something to welcome something new. And it's that transition, that time in between the old way and the new way. So we've got the old way that we're used to, we've been doing this way for 10 years, and we've got the new way. And it's that time in between that people struggle with. William Bridges calls that the middle zone. And if you've watched cartoons, if you think about Linus with his blanket, he was never away from his blanket. And then let's say you did laundry one day and Linus's blanket ends up in the dryer or the washer. He's in the middle zone. He doesn't know what to do. And that's what happens in the workplace is people struggle with transition, not so much the change. And initially I disagreed with that. And then I really started thinking about, no, I like that perspective because people might like or not like a new policy, but what causes them grief or challenge or frustration is making the new policy work. Getting rid of what we used to do and starting what we're going to do. It's the transition time. So one of the things you can do to actually help with morale and certainly support your team through a team charter is to be conscious of the middle zone and recognize that we need to spend time sometimes as a team talking about how are we going to make that transition as smooth as possible, as comfortable as possible, and have it done in a way that doesn't negatively impact our team. So back to the team that had kind of fallen off the trails, I also ask questions like, what is it like when you create a commitment and you're excited and you're standing behind it, and then you see some of your team members not committed to it? How does that affect the team? What does that do? And we had a really frank conversation. No blaming, no insults. It was just an honest, open communication. And it was in that dialogue that this team's trust and comfort with vulnerability improved dramatically. And so that meeting, we spent more time talking about how they would handle the meeting outside the meeting. So if in future the team agrees to something, or two people in a conversation agree to something, and then it falls off the tracks, how will they deal with it effectively? And then they also realized that they didn't have communication skills that supported them in this. So when they saw, it started out with two people who just had a gossip session and really bashed each other, and how they were frustrated with other things that didn't get addressed. And that's what happened. And then those two people kind of went and found their alliances. So it grew very quickly. What they realized is that they didn't feel equipped to get out of the conversation, and they didn't know how to comfortably give feedback to each other. So it just grew. And that's a teachable skill. Teaching people feedback and communication and conflict resolution skills, that's teachable. Those are all things that we can fix and make a huge, significant difference in our workplace. So they actually called me in to do a couple of hours training. It wasn't a big, long training, but we devoted a couple of hours. And then every meeting that I did, I decided to work with that team over 6 months. And we just had these check-in meetings every 6 weeks for about an hour and a half. So they weren't the big, full one day. And the check-in meetings were basically the review and learn process that I love to talk about, which is 4 questions. What went well? What was a challenge? What did I learn? And what will I do differently? So these are things that you can actually bring into your team meetings without even doing a team charter. You can start to look at where does our team need some skills, and at a staff meeting you can use some videos to actually teach people about skills. I love a video by Brene Brown. It's a cartoon, and if you've been in a workshop with me recently, you've probably seen it. It's a cartoon on blame, and it's about 3.5 minutes, so it's not long, but it's funny and it's so honest, and it is so true. Every time I show it, people can completely relate to this video. So there's an example of what you could do in a staff meeting. You could bring in a video and watch it, and then have a conversation for 10 minutes around blame, and turn it back to the team. So, in our team, if we don't want to be a team that is blaming one another or blaming external funders or government or the world economy, if we don't want to be blamers, instead we want to be solvers, how do we make that change happen in our workplace? So you can use about 15 minutes to brainstorm as a team some ways that they can solve problems instead of blaming people about problems. I've seen people bring in a new skill. Somebody goes to a workshop, for example, in the team, or they go to a training session. Have them come back and train the team on what they learned. That's fantastic, because you're actually helping them build their confidence, and you're cross-training the team without having them to go anywhere. And what you've done for the person who has just learned that skill at the training they attended is you help them build their confidence and help them be part of making a better team environment. So these are a few of the many, many ways that you can improve morale and improve the ways in which people work together. So we do a monthly call for those of you that are on our newsletter list. The next date is, let me just grab that for you. The next date is June 12th at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, which is 8 Pacific or 11 Eastern, depending on what time zone you're in. And you'll receive a notice about that. And again, it'll be recorded. So if you can't join us live, no problem. We'll get the video replay to you. And what we're going to be talking about at that particular one is how to facilitate conflict conversations. So here's where this one came up. I get a lot of feedback at presentations I do where people want to go deeper on the conversation of resolving conflict. And I had at the last few conferences I spoke at, there was a lot of interest from people around how do I facilitate conflict conversations. So if I'm a supervisor, if I'm a board member, if I'm a staff and I'm working with two colleagues on a project, how do I facilitate the conversation so that it stays on track and it stays respectful? So what I'm going to be doing on June 12th's webinar is teaching how do you facilitate, what do you need to do to set up the conversation for success? How do you handle it if you're facilitating a dialogue with two people or even with a team, or if with a committee? Many of you work on committees that fall off the tracks. And how can you facilitate bringing things back to normal or better than normal? And how do you handle it if people get emotional or if there's a lot of drama? That's what we'll be talking about June 12th. And of course, it'll be recorded for you. You're welcome to share these in your organization. I always welcome your comments and questions. So I'm simply an email or a phone call away. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I wish you well for the rest of the week. It's Thursday, so you've got one more week left, or one more day to the weekend, or if you work shifts, maybe not. But I want to wish you well, and we will see you in June. Thanks for joining us, folks.